You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
We've covered commemoration on this show before. We've talked a little bit about the Great War. In fact, we've talked a lot about the Great War, but it's been the past 5 years it's been important, I think, to talk about the Great War because, well, people would listen to stories about the Great War, particularly in Australia. We haven't talked so much about the aftermath of the Great War, and you will know that recently we've been focusing on some social aspects of war and its impact on society, particularly in my home country of Australia. Why? Because it is better than any of your other home countries. No, that's not fair. But I kind of do believe it. But my actual home country is Tasmania, for those listeners that didn't know that. So I'm an import into Australia. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm Mick, the humblest host you know, with a show named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. What is news in the Dead Prussian world? Well, the TDP community. That's hashtag TDP community if you are a social neophyte like myself. We are a social network. That's right. We're a podcast that has launched a social network. I'm not saying I'm going to get as rich as Mark Zuckerberg, but he doesn't answer my calls either. Now, the idea behind the social network is it's a nice, safe place for listeners of the show to jump online and talk about the types of concepts we discuss on the show. You can jump on there and talk about my jokes. You can slag me off if you want. I don't really mind as long as you jump on there and support us. Now, it does cost a couple of dollars. So if you want to share some tin with the show, please feel free to do that. It's $5 a month and $50 a year, or $90 for a 2-year subscription. So to get the best deal, you can throw 90 bob our way. But you get your value for money because it is an entire social network with a community. We have writing groups, we have reading groups, we have a Roman history group. And the whole idea behind it is that you can jump onto our network and be really, really nerdy about war and warfare. Now, as you picked up in my intro, we're probably talking about something you've heard a bit about before on the show, the Great War or the First World War. We've also talked a little bit about commemoration, and I'm sure a lot of listeners know my thoughts on commemoration and where it sits in today's society. But we're also talking about the aftermath of commemoration. And the reason we're doing this is because I was alerted to a great publication by some of my friends at New South Books or UNSW Press. And the book is called The Great War, Aftermath and Commemoration. And the best thing about this book is I managed to convince the editors of the book to come on the show. So my guest today, my first guest is Dr. Carolyn Holbrook. She is working on a history of Australians' attitudes towards their federal system of government. Geez, I'm glad we're not talking about that specific topic. A lot of listeners know my attitude. Now, she is interested in the nature of state, national and imperial attachments, and how they have been affected by geography, events, and the passage of time. Her other major project is a collaboration with Professor James Walter at Monash University. It's where I did my university experience when I was in high school. Didn't end up going there, but that's no slight on Monash. I loved it. About the history of Australian public policy since the 1940s, with a particular focus on the Indigenous refugee housing and employment policies. Well, talk about relevant to today's problems. Now, Carolyn's book about the history of how Australians have remembered the First World War, Anzac, the unauthorised biography, was published in 2014. We may even have to get Carolyn back on the show for a very specific deep dive into that particular book. Now, my next guest, and I'm told I've absolutely nailed the pronunciation of his name, so now that we're on the record, I will completely stuff it up, is Professor Keir Reeves. He has an undergraduate degree in Arts and Economics from Monash University, and he was later awarded an MA and PhD in History from the University of Melbourne. In 2013, he was a visiting fellow, and now he's a life fellow, which is good. It's much better than a death fellow, at Clare Hall, Cambridge, and a visiting researcher at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, University of Cambridge. Here he worked with the Cambridge Heritage Research Group in the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology. He's a visiting researcher at the Ghent University and has been a senior Ryden Fellow and Bicentennial Fellow at the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies, King's College London, and SOAS. He is the current historian on the Public Records Advisory Council for the Public Records Office of Victoria and is an executive member of Oz Heritage. His teaching is concentrated on history and heritage. Keir is a long-time advocate of field-based learning as a way of discovering the history and cultural heritage of regional Australia, Asia, and the Pacific. Field-based learning must be fantastic. I know there's a lot of us that do touch parking. That's kind of what field-based learning is. Carolyn and Keir, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Now, because my listeners know how terrible I am at coordinating multiple guest interviews, I'm literally just going to ask you by name each stage through the questions and sound like a controlling teacher. But because you've both taught, I think that's okay to do because it's a little bit of revenge for your students. Now, Carolyn, before we start discussing the Great War and commemoration, I'm keen to find out about how you personally got interested in the topic itself.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you for your interest. I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, and in Perth, and I remember that Anzac was not a big deal. I have vague memories in primary school of an Anzac Day service at Assembly, and barely any memory of anything to do with Anzac Day at high school. I was interested personally in the First World War because I just loved history, but it was just such a small part of my childhood and adolescence that I was curious about the fact that it seems to have become such a huge deal in contemporary Australia. So I guess the basic sort of intellectual question for me about the First World War is, how did Anzac commemoration go from being something that seemed a sort of minor part of Australian nationalism and Australian identity when I was young to being such a big deal in contemporary Australia? So that was probably the sort of intellectual question that got me interested in studying the First World War. But I would say that alongside that was also a more personal kind of emotional interest. I remember learning about the Battle of the Somme in my year 10, I think it was, history class. And I remember the teacher, Mrs. Hardy, saying that 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded on the first day of the Somme. And how shocked that made me. And then I must have been interested enough to go down to the newsagent in Perth and buy a book about Gallipoli, because I've still got that book and it's from 1985. So that would have been a fairly unusual interest for a 15-year-old schoolgirl in 1985. And in fact, in the introduction to this sort of small pamphlet type book, the author says that Anzac is not particularly popular and it seems to be fading. And there was just a general view that Anzac commemoration was going to die out in the 1970s and 1980s.
Yeah.
And then when I was a bit older, I read that Pat Barker trilogy about the First World War, and it was like a psychological perspective in 3 novels about the effect of the First World War and the development of psychiatry, the psychiatry of the understanding of trauma and post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
So that sort of psychological aspect of it really interested me. And then when I did the PhD in the book, I found out that this view about trauma and the traumatic effects of war is very much interlinked in explaining the resurgence of the popularity of Anzac. But they're the sort of 2 things that interested me in the First World War.
Wow. I think the most fascinating part about that is that they have books over in Perth, ladies and gentlemen. So that's a shocker for me. But no, the Anzac stuff is fascinating. And we've already made a promise, listeners, off air, that we are not going to get too deep into the rabbit holes. We're going to focus on the topic tonight, and I will limit my rants about Anzac commemoration. I'm not even going to mention that all you have to do is go to a school and you get to march in Anzac Day these days. Now, Keir, I guess it's your turn. How did you become interested in this topic?
My interest was personal in the first instance, like so many people, Mick. I remember my first real inkling of Anzac was a pretty populous one. I went to see Gallipoli with my grandmother, and I noticed at the end of the movie that she was crying, and I asked her what was happening, and she basically explained that one of her relatives, Private Ted Harrison, had died in the Palestine, and that from that moment I was always kind of interested in the family narrative. And then as I became an academic and historian teaching Australian history, it became apparent to me that you can't really teach Australian history without at least engaging a little bit with Anzac. And over time, I was working with a number of people. History led me into heritage. I was always interested in how history was presented in the present day, and that necessarily led me into a number of projects that considered Australians at war, and particularly the centenary of Anzac, which I was part of a few projects. But ultimately, it was really those early discussions around family memories that so many people find their way into considering Australians at war.
It's interesting, isn't it? The family connection often doesn't get brought out that much on this show, but as you mentioned, your family connection, I know that my connection with the First World War was my great-grandmother, who I was lucky enough to torment when I was a child. But when I became a teenager and she'd long passed, my grandmother gave me the photo of a grave of one of her uncles to look after. And that uncle actually was the fiancé of my great-grandmother, but then was killed in Belgium. And so my great-grandmother married his brother, as was, it's something that happened a bit back then. And you kind of forget that a lot of the time. People forget about this personal connection. And I suppose with Australia being such a small nation, it had quite a deep effect. Tasmania being even smaller nation from where I am, and it being even greater effect. Now, Carolyn, the book and topic we are discussing today is The Great War, Aftermath and Commemoration. Are you able to provide our listeners with a broad overview of the book?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of what Keir and I were trying to do with the book, we historians have been sort of like blowflies around a piece of rotting meat in the past 10 or 20 years or so in regard to Anzac commemoration. They've noticed that, like I did, they've noticed that it's gone from something that was expected to sort of dwindle and die away with the last of the old veterans in the 1970s and 1980s to something that seems to form the sort of nucleus of Australian national identity, and something that politicians are sort of falling over themselves to associate themselves with. So there's been a lot of historical research about the First World War and Anzac commemoration in the past couple of decades, a lot of it leading up and sort of culminating in the centenary of the First World War. So Keir and I sort of got to thinking that if we enlist a group of stellar historians and do some sort of snappy chapters, some kind of punchy, easy to read sort of chapters that will appeal to a wider audience, that present sort of cutting edge research from prominent historians, ranging from sort of famous names like Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds and Frank Bongiorno, Joan Beaumont, to some younger and emerging people, then it might provide some sort of, in a sense, a full stop to the historiography of the Great War that's sort of been going on for so long in Australia, in a sense that this has been something the historians have sort of turned over and over and over, and perhaps it's time for us to sort of summarize where we've got to, and then move on to some other subjects. So what we do in the book, it was published in 2019, the centenary of the peace at Versailles. So what we do in the book is we have some chapters that look at the peace conference and the aftermath of the war for things like politics, Australian strategic and foreign policy.
Yeah.
And then we move on to the theme of commemoration, and we have a whole lot of historians talking about how the war has been represented and commemorated. And then that sort of leads to my final chapter, which tries to sort of write a first sort of scratchy history of the centenary of the Great War, and tries to sort of put all the pieces in place and explain how Anzac functions in the contemporary Australian psyche.
Yeah, okay. It's it's fascinating. So for listeners out there, we'll be familiar with some of the names, some of your chapter authors, because they've been on the show, or they've been referred to on the show by other guests, and I know some of the people. I apologise to Tom Rogers and a couple of other people on this list, like Maggie, who are still awaiting a run sheet from me, because I've asked them if they'd be interviewed about their own books, and I think I've failed. I'll blame the co-producer on this one, but I failed to get back to them. The way the book is laid out is quite interesting, and I'll go to Keir for this one because you divide it up into 4 themes. Now, the first theme, we'll go in order of the book because it just makes my life easier. I'm a pretty simple fella. The first theme is War's End, and it's almost got like a nice sort of apocalyptic fiction type title there, and it covers everything from repatriation of the AIF through to the subsequent plans for defending Australia. What did you find most fascinating about this particular theme, the War's End theme?
Well, I'm just mindful, Mick, that Jane Beaumont, one of the contributors, has suggested there's 3 approaches to Australian military history. One is these traditional military histories that focus upon the commands, the operations, and the empirical studies of leadership. There's the War and Society branch that tends to look at the impact of or legacy of the war on the domestic society, the politics and the economics. And then there's the memory studies, which I think we just touched on then, you and I, in terms of those family memories.
Yeah.
It looks at the impact of war on individuals. And if you look at this section of the book, it tries to, I think it's got a bit of all of that. And you certainly get the story of Thomas O'Donnell from Ambeg Sunter, who, for the readers aren't aware, is somebody who begins as a loyalist and an ardent supporter of the war and ends up supporting Irish Home Rule and is tried for treason. So he's sort of one of those characters that gets stuck in the history and the politics of the time. And I found him in some respects analogous to some sort of John Curtin style figure who was also incarcerated for his anti-conscription activities. And then there's just a simple question of what to do. And I think Malia and others, and Martin Crotty, when they're looking at bringing the troops home, they're very real. The practicalities of that, or indeed what happens with repatriation of some of these, not all, as Carolyn and Joan and others argue, shattered Anzacs, but some of them are, and they desperately need benefits following the war. Yeah. So I think that what I really like about this section of the book is that we were trying to quite deliberately provide a suite of different things that confronted Australia at the war's end. And this is the most historical part of the book, I think. We get into other discussions later on with legacies and commemoration or personal memories. But for this one, I think you get a nice overview of what happened in the immediacy of the year or the decade following the armistice. And of course, Bart Zeno sets up the armistice and the civilian experience so well early on in the book to give a bit of a flavour of where Carolyn and I were coming from with the volume.
Yeah, it's a section that I found quite interesting in terms of if you contrast it with what we're seeing now in terms of the discussion of veterans, their role in society. We've been at war for 20 years, and most Australians probably don't really understand we're still technically at war in 2 countries at the moment. Although we've had some very recent developments in one of those countries. Whether or not that'll change, whether or not we're at war, is yet to be seen. But the idea of the mad, bad, or sad veteran experience is not new. I mean, arguably, when Pompey was arguing for land for his veterans of his eastern campaigns in ancient Rome, it's something that just keeps coming around. But it can be particularly.
I'm sure it's a recurring narrative. Yeah, absolutely.
It can be particularly enlightening when you read comments of this is it may have been a centenary ago, but relatively recent history. You look at the same issues, and then you look at what we went later on in Australian society. You're like, we need more people reading this, or we need more people listening to this podcast, I guess. So, Carolyn, the next theme in the book is kind of a little bit different from the war's end piece. It's the social, political, and personal legacies. It touches on the legacy aspect of the war, which is a little bit what we mentioned about earlier about Anzacs and the idea of an Anzac, the idea of the First World War in Australian culture and politics in particular, because it's pretty much it's free political credit these days. I told everyone I wouldn't put my spin on it, but it's my show. I can do whatever I want. But you also cover things like Indigenous Australians and the idea of Anzacs and how that may include, or in other ways, it doesn't include a wide culture. We've had Shannon Maskell-Dare on the show before. In fact, she was our last guest last episode, but her previous interview was about, Australia's best sniper was a Chinese Australian at Gallipoli. How many Australians know that, right? So what was it about this particular section, the social, political, and personal legacies, that actually resonated with you as an editor?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different aspects to this section. It's such a broad theme. And Frank Bongiorno writes in a really interesting way about politics in the wake of the First World War, and how there's sort of a common understanding, at least among historians, that not a lot actually happened in the 1920s and the 1930s under these conservative governments. But he sort of shakes up that interpretation a bit and goes through a sort of list of in some ways, fairly innovative things that happened during that period. And he concludes that one of probably the biggest legacy of the war in terms of politics was the appearance of the Country Party. Richard Trembath has a really interesting and well-written chapter about Indigenous veterans and their experience with the RSL, and how if they fought for Australia and they fought well, and of course, and all those kinds of things. And then when they got back, they had to fight in many instances to have their rights recognised and to be included and to be sort of incorporated within that sort of Anzac mythology. And one of the really interesting things about the centenary of Anzac in the last few years has been the way in which Indigenous Australians have been welcomed into the fold. There's been lots of initiatives, like the play Black Diggers, and lots of funding to uncover Indigenous Anzacs. So you know, that's taken a while for them to be, you know, properly recognised and incorporated. But probably one of the big themes that came through in this section, and one of probably the major themes that Keir and I got out of the book and collecting this group of essays, I think, was the idea of don't forget the resilient soldier. So when I wrote my Anzac, the unauthorised biography, which is a history basically of how Australians have remembered the First World War, one of the big themes to come out of that was when Anzac seemed to be petering away in the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of that was because younger Australians were saying Anzac is outdated, it's racist, it's bigoted, it's sexist, it's chauvinistic, because it was a mythology that was grounded in the values of the early 20th century. So people who sort of went to uni in the 50s and 60s just couldn't relate to it. And so there was a lot of criticism of the old diggers. People said they just sort of got drunk and vomited in public on Anzac Day and that kind of thing. So that sort of died away. But what happened in the resurgence, and it happened around the time of Peter Weir's film Gallipoli in 1981, was a different kind of version of the Anzac legend, and it was something that younger Australians could relate to more. It was sort of more like a post-Vietnam version of Anzac. So there was actually less emphasis on those old codgers from the RSL who were supportive of things like white Australia and, you know, old-fashioned. And there was more of an emphasis on just them as young men like Archie and Frank from the film Gallipoli. And if you think of the film Gallipoli, they're not warriors, they don't fight. The only battle scene is in the last minutes, right? And Archie doesn't even have a weapon. He drops his rifle and runs into the Turkish machine gun fire and has his arms outstretched in a sort of crucifix, sort of Jesus type analogy. So the face of Anzac has changed. It's become less violent, less militaristic. And if you look at it, there's a lot more language about suffering and tragedy and sacrifice. So that sort of whole PTSD, post-traumatic stress, the traumatic effects of war, that really came out after Vietnam, seeped into Anzac commemoration as well, and has influenced Anzac commemoration. So, you know, the most fascinating thing for me about history is not so much what happened, but how we selectively remember what happened. So in the past 20 years or so, this revival of Anzac has gone hand in hand with a preference for remembering the trauma and the suffering. And so the pendulum has perhaps swung far that way. And what some of the chapters are saying, people like Joan Beaumont, and even Keir in some ways in his co-authored chapter, and Tom Rogers, is that the war and war trauma can't explain everything. And hang on, a lot of people came back from the war and lived decent lives. And we have to remember the resilient as well as the people who came back and didn't cope. And Joan Beaumont in her chapter features 3 soldiers, Hugo Throssell from WA,
Yep.
who won the BC, Charles Hawker he fought for the British Army, but he went back to South Australia and became a politician, and Pompey Elliott from Melbourne, who was a prominent general, I think, was he in the end?
Yeah, one of the best. Yeah. Doesn't get enough airtime.
Well, so Throssell and Pompey Elliott committed suicide during the 1930s, and Charles Hawker, who was the most seriously wounded during the war, he was killed sadly in a plane crash in 1938, but he thrived after the war and had a big career in politics. So Joan sort of ponders why Hugo Throssell and Pompey Elliott didn't make it and why Hawker did thrive, and it's sort of an impossible question to answer, but she talks about the double shock of the war and its trauma and then the depression. But then she goes on to suggest that we must remember they're resilient and not just the ones who were wrecked by the war.
Yeah, I mean, statistically, it's the resilient majority. A lot. The focus on trauma is a focus on a small group of people that need a helping hand. But we tend to, I guess it's the voyeurism within people. People who succeed aren't as good a story. But it had me thinking about 2 things. One, ladies and gentlemen, this veteran hasn't gotten drunk on Anzac Day and vomited in public since 2011. So that's a positive story out there. Was a member of the RSL at the time. But the other one is the old hero worship of Albert Jacka. Graduated into the hero worship of Simpson and his donkey. And we don't see so much about Albert Jacka that he was celebrated, I suppose, more in the 40s, 50s, and 60s than Simpson. But now Simpson is what a compassionate nation deems worthy of celebrating. So the commemoration and the switch is quite interesting. And there are probably some really good reasons later on in life why people don't really warm to Albert Jacka, and there's probably some reasons early on in life why people didn't necessarily think Simpson was the best soldier out there, although his compassion is what made him successful. So I find it fascinating, particularly the range you have in that section of all the different contributions, particularly and Tom Rogers' stuff on frontier violence in Australia. Just fascinating stuff. Now, Keir, the next one is one that I think is often not discussed as much as it should be in popular conversations. It's one that I still owe Meggie an interview on, but it's about representing the Great War. So, what sort of ways has the war been represented in the Australian context, and what does that sort of mean for how we commemorate the war?
Yeah, sure, Mick. Absolutely, it hasn't been discussed enough. And if you look at the book, folks, it's the shortest section of the book, so perhaps we haven't discussed it enough.
I wasn't going to say it.
But it's not for want of trying either. But Carol and I both thought it was a very important part of any discussion of commemoration, the representation of the war. And if you look at Maggie, and I think it would be a fantastic episode as well. She talks about a suitable memorial, and she's two very unusual, very different characters in being the Great War journalist and chronicler of Anzac, and the artist Will Dyson, who who's a radical left wing artist in many ways, who has quite an austere take on Anzac. But they obviously got on very well, and I think actually Bean made a case for Dyson, who died young, to have his own gallery at the Australian War Memorial. But she just goes through that. I think what her chapter reminds me in a broader context, and that's what I think we're always searching for, and Carolyn definitely touches on this a lot in her work, of those bigger themes. And I think what you find with the representing the Great War, the state is always there. There's always the panoply of the state being deployed to commemorate and also to represent, whether it's through a desire to have an official art program, or the staging of a particular centenary, and that's what Drew Ginn talks about in his close reading of Brisbane. It was good to get a Northern Australian perspective.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Bruce Gates said he looks at the whole question of remembering and forgetting, as he puts it, of the First World War at the Sir John Monash Centre in France, which is probably one of the more contentious chapters in the book, but it asks big questions about commemoration, remembering, representation of Australians at war, our face, if you like, to a global audience, remembering it's a European one, and also just the amount of resources that we may want to touch on later on that are committed to certain initiatives. Because ultimately, this is a cultural initiative. The John Monash Centre is essentially a museum in many respects, or an interpretation centre, and it involves, certainly by cultural sector standards, a very, very large commitment, and as to other things that have been done as a result of the First World War commemoration in Australia. But Carolyn might want to comment on that a bit more later on. So I reckon this section of the book was really important because it actually lets the reader know what sort of strategies, what sort of priorities were in place to represent the war over time, from the conclusion of the war up to and including the centenary, where there was obviously a massive renewed interest.
Yeah. I find some of those chapters now. I mean, it's great that you got someone from Northern Australia who could read and write to do a chapter for you, which is good.
We did well. We got people from the west that were stars, and then we got some folk up north. It was good. We've even got a Tasmanian. Who can help us out as well. Was the pomp there? It's fantastic. We're okay on the mainland, Mick.
You're doing all right. I can comment on Northern Australia because I've married I've got a daughter who's a Queenslander, and I've spent so much time up there just being thrown around cyclones. I think I can do that, but coming from the underdeveloped state or nation, as I say, ladies and gents, take everything with good faith. And the Sir John Ash, we'll call him Sir John Ash for the purposes of the podcast. But that centre over there is the one thing you didn't mention was it's a great piece of cultural imperialism. We cannot let them forget that Australia won the Great War and saved them. One thing that I did actually find fascinating was the Second World War commemoration in El Alamein. That's actually, a lot of that's done in conjunction with the Australian War Memorial. It's a very similar feel of the role that the Australians had in winning the Second World War, and I wonder how much of that thought goes behind the cultural awareness of what we're actually saying sometimes when we do our commemoration. Which I'm not saying we shouldn't commemorate things, but it seems to me that they're always well received, but you don't necessarily see it next to a memorial of the same country and culture where we put our memorials, which is always an interesting take on things. Now I'll move to the fourth theme. If we were only up to the fourth chapter, this was going to be a long episode. I'll go to the fourth theme. This one's for you, Carolyn, which actually concludes with your own chapter, so it's almost like I planned it out. And that's about commemorating the Great War. It is literally called Commemorating the Great War, which is good. You've got one theme that directly links to the title, which is brilliant. And we've just been through centenary commemoration, so I know a lot of listeners have got it in their heads. A lot of Australians have seen it. A lot of our overseas listeners, the majority of our listeners are actually US listeners and UK listeners. It's good because they like the idea of Australians being able to produce a podcast because they think we're all just drunk layabouts, but we're not. We're actually cultural imperialists. But the idea of commemorating in Australia is very different from the way we see it. And I've attended Anzac Day ceremonies in New Caledonia. Great event put on by the French. I've attended Anzac ceremonies in Kenya. Great event put on the middle of the scrub by Kenyan Army people once we told them what it was. Even in the UK, a great Anzac event. And as listeners have always heard, I like to remind people there were a lot more British soldiers lost their lives at Gallipoli than Australian soldiers. So, there's quite a few Canadian soldiers, quite a few Indian soldiers lost their lives there. So for them to honour Anzac Day is quite important. So, Carolyn, what did you find fascinating, interesting about how we commemorate the Great War?
This is really getting to the sort of juicy end of all this Anzac stuff, I think, and the political end and the contention, and and we're sort of diving into the culture wars when we talk about commemorating the Great War. But just in terms of the chapters that we've got there, we've got a French historian called Romain Farthy, and he writes He's interesting because he can compare the way that Australians remember the First World War to the way that the French remember the war.
Yeah.
Of course, they lost, I think 1 million people were killed, and the big swathes of their countryside were ruined, and it had an enormous effect on France, of course. And Romain has also written a book about Villers-Bretonneux, where we've got the John Ash Centre, of course. But Romain talks about the fact that in somewhere like France, Remembrance Day is the principal day on which the First World War is sort of remembered and commemorated. Why in Australia is Remembrance Day the poor cousin of Anzac Day? So that's the sort of question Romain asks. And then he comes back to a theme that runs, an argument that runs through the whole book, chapters like Maggie's chapter about war painting in Australia compared to other countries like Canada. It's because for Australia, the First World War has always been about much more than remembering the First World War. It's our moment of nationhood, of national birth, of baptism, whatever metaphor you use. So in addition to the mourning, the 60,000 dead and 160,000 wounded, etc., it's also had an element of celebration and national pride. So that's the thing that makes Australian commemoration of the First World War so distinctive, I think. And if you go back and look at early commemorations, which I did for the book that I wrote about that, there was the mourning and the sadness was much more palpable because obviously the death was so much closer. But there was certainly always that element of nationalism and national pride. Then that seemed to sort of die away in the 1960s, 1970s because it sort of got this stench of militarism around before the Vietnam War, but also around the time of the Vietnam War. So that pride thing had to sort of be turned down. And in the 60s and 70s, the original members of the RSL, they were people who were probably born around the 1890s. They were tending to die out. So there was this sort of vacuum at the head of commemoration of the First World War. So commemoration was dwindling, the old blokes were dying off, and it was expected to die out. And what happened was politicians would sort of run a mile from it. Like I interviewed Malcolm Fraser in 2012 about Anzac commemoration. He was Prime Minister between 1975 and 1983. And he said, look, if I'd got on a plane and gone to Gallipoli for Anzac Day, people would have said, what on earth is Fraser doing? It just was not the done thing. Whereas now it would look odd if a Prime Minister didn't go to Anzac Day, to Anzac Cove for Anzac Day. So what happened was the politicians sniffed the changing temperature, the renewed sympathy for Anzac commemoration, and they stepped into the breach. And ever since then, it's been politically led Anzac commemoration. That's the thing that makes people like me and probably people like you a bit suspicious. Why politicians throw ridiculous bucket loads of money into it? What's going on?
It's and I mean we're going to go to the bonus question soon, so we'll. I really want to do a chat about this on the bonus question for our subscribing legends, but for those listeners out there who are a bit familiar with Australian history and cultural wars and things like that, we have this section has both Henry Reynolds and David Stevens writing chapters in there, and very, very strong views on Anzac and commemoration. Very controversial. I think Henry wrote the "What Is Wrong with Anzac" the book, maybe. And I know that David
he was
Stevens
one of the co-authors.
Yeah, that's right. He was one of the co-authors. It's quite interesting. So people should. It's I actually, one of the interesting things about this is I remember my first history lecture at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and a lecturer stood up the front and said that, Gallipoli was a horrible failure, and for a heap of 18-year-olds who just joined the military, in the middle of our idol worshipping of what the Australian military was and its heritage, we thought this was blasphemous. And then he proceeded to spend. This was Robin Pryor, who I'm not sure if he listens to the show. He does tweet every now and then. He's then spent the next 6 months explaining to us, the reality of Gallipoli versus what we'd grown up on as kids. Because I grew up as that resurgence started in the 80s and 90s. I'm showing my age, listeners. But we'll move on to the bonus question for those people who deem us worthy of their support and their coin. And for those who just like the free show, well, I think you're fantastic too. But you can just bugger off for a second. We'll pause. So that was fascinating discussion. Thanks, Carolyn and Keir, particularly on the amount of resources governments, particularly the Australian government, have poured into commemoration, the idea of commemoration, and how it's changed throughout the ages. So, listeners, if you want a really interesting, in-depth discussion on how that happened, sign up for the bonus content, and you'll get it. If you don't, well, that's fine. You can bugger off. Now, we're up to the final question. Now, I used to call this the butcher's bill for coming on the show, but it's probably not the right term to use on a discussion about the Great War. But this is the price, I suppose, I charge all my guests for them coming on the show and providing me content. So I'm a little bit greedy in terms of favours from my guests. But Carolyn and Keir, my final question is one I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show, is to define wars in as many ways possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself, because it is something that affects society, and it's important that we constantly debate, define, and discuss its effect and its purpose. So now I ask each guest to finish a sentence. That sentence is war is. So I ask you, we'll go with Keir. I ask you, Keir, to finish the sentence, war is.
I think war is a tragedy, and to quote Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th President and Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed.
Oh, brilliant. That's geez, good one, Dwight. That's brilliant.
Right.
Unfortunately, I'm one of those people that is a Bee Gees fan. So as soon as you said war is a tragedy, I got that disco pop song stuck in
Tragedy.
my head.
But,
that's the one. But war is a tragedy. In fact, that's quite a good response, and we tend to find historians.
See, another great band, another great thing from Queensland, Mick. The Bee Gees by the Isle of Man.
It is. That's true. Queensland's got to win out on top of this, aren't they? Now, Carolyn, you don't have to discuss disco in your answer, but I ask you to finish the sentence. War is.
Okay. War is still being fought by politicians, soldiers, of course, historians, and increasingly commercial interests long after the guns have gone quiet.
Ooh, that's interesting. That's quite good. And I like you guys have obviously worked together before, because there's a nice tie-in between the Eisenhower quote and the tragedy of war and the commercial interests there mentioned. This is not the time to talk about my day job. But look, Carolyn and Keir, it has been a fascinating chat. In fact, I think this is probably going to be quite a long episode, and I don't care. This has been amazing. Quite interested in commemoration. We love talking about the Great War on this show. And listeners, I think you'll find something in this book that is very different from what you are fed. This is something you select yourself to read, and it is different from what you were fed about the Great War. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much for having us. Thanks for the dad jokes.
That's the only thing I'm good at. Ladies and gentlemen, please support Carolyn and Keir by going out and buying their book. I have all the links in the show notes, and I know that they work on as many of the platforms that we are on, and we have noted that we're not on Spotify. It's been raised very recently to me, but we will seek to rectify that once I can get around a few copyright issues. Please grab the book, The Great War, Aftermath and Commemoration. And also support our guests on Twitter. Now, Carolyn's on Twitter at Sigmund Marks, which is Sigmund spelt the usual way, and Marks spelt the Carl way. I don't think Keir's on Twitter. Are you on Twitter, Keir?
No, I'm not, mate. I probably should be.
All right, listeners, don't follow Keir on Twitter, because it's not him. If you found a Keir Reeves out there, don't follow them. It's probably a bot, actually. And also, listeners, please join the TDP community. If you're interested in discussing this episode further, I will be discussing it. Please jump on and sign up to our writers group. The next writing event, I think, is in April, but the next book club event will be on the 29th of March. We're covering the book Bodies of Men, written by an Australian author, Nigel Featherstone. It's absolutely fascinating, and you have not read an Australian fiction work about the Second World War like it before. I can guarantee that. I haven't read them all, but there is nothing else like Bodies of Men out there. Until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.